All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, going through a series of video presentations for the Rankin Technical College Application and Web Development AWD1111 .NET Framework with Web Databases class. The textbook for the class is ASP.NET MVC with Entity Framework and CSS by Mr. Lee Naylor, and we are finishing up Chapter 10 of the text, and I'm on page 391, and we're getting into dealing with concurrent database updates. So, as you can see, this chapter deals with a scenario in which two different users try to modify a database record at the same time. Concurrency is a very big topic, because how do you want to handle this? All right. We cover cases where a record has been edited or deleted and discuss how to inform users that a record has changed since they accessed it and attempted to change it themselves. So imagine you work as an example for an insurance company, all right, and you get someone who has both just gotten married and has moved, all right. So you've got one person who finds out that the person's gotten married, so they let's say they go through a name change. So they bring up their record and change the name. Then another person finds out that the person is moved, so they attempt to change their address. All right? So, as it says, by default, when you use the entity framework, when two users edit a record at the same time, they use the last in wins mentality. So the last person to edit the record has all their values saved into the database. This could cause an issue if there's two people editing the same record at the same time. Changes made by the first user are then overwritten by the second user, assuming they both open the edit screen prior to any edits being saved. There are several ways to deal with this scenario, as they mention on page 392. Some are more complex than others, such as the database locking mechanism known as pessimistic concurrency. Entity Framework provides support for optimistic concurrency, allowing conflicts to happen, but when they do happen, the system is aware of them and is able to react, which it can do in a number of different ways. For example, if they allow the last wins scenario to occur, all right, they can do that, or they can allow the first set of edits to occur and then notify the second user that the values have changed since they loaded them. This is known as store wins, and the author is going to demonstrate a simple example of how to implement this with the category entity as an example. In order to know that a database row has changed, some form of tracking is required. A typical scenario for this using the entity framework is to use the field's row version with a .NET type of byte array that holds the sequential data and is updated each time the row is updated in the database. To track this, as it says, start by adding a row version property, as we've done right here, into our category class. All right. The timestamp attribute, as it says, specifies that this column is included in the where part of any update and delete commands. Next, we add a migration, all right, by running the command here and the update. So a new column called row version will now be added to the categories table, as shown in the figure on the next page. You can see that although the data type was defined as byte, all right, the data is defined as row version. So it's shown right there, all right, on page 393. Next, we have to go in and modify the post version of the edit method. Remember, it's normally going to be the post that you're going to be making major changes to, because we're talking about actually here, in this case, wanting to write something. So we are going to be changing the data in the database. All right, so we have to modify it as follows to check for data conflicts when editing a category. Ensure you add the using system.entity.infrastructure at the top of the file so that it can be done. All right. So we have changed the signature of the method to take just the ID and the row version parameters and then manually build an array of fields to bind. So in other words, we want to be able to tell when somebody brings up their copy of something in the database, whether or not someone else has changed that or is making changes to it since they brought up their copy. That's exactly what they're talking about here. All right, I don't know if it pays to go through much more than that. Again, it is a boatload of code. If a database entry is not null, the current database values are obtained and cast into a category object. Yeah. All right. So again, bottom line is concurrency is a big problem. You as a developer have to figure out between you and the people you're creating the project for, how do you want to handle multiple people possibly changing the same data. Now, one thing they haven't really even talked about here is you can have a locking type of mechanism so that when one person opens up a database, you can lock that database, and you can lock it on different levels. You can lock the entire database, you can lock just a table, you can lock just a row in a table. I think you can even lock just a field in a row in a table. So there's many different ways that this can be handled. All right, they want us to come in here. I'm already in as administrator. They say open a new browser tab with the site running, and you will also be logged in as an admin user. Then they want you to come in and start making some tests. The key thing is, let's take a look at what we get here. Whoops. All right. The record has been modified by another user after you loaded the screen. Your changes have not been saved. All right. The new values in the database are shown below. If you want to overwrite these values with changes, then click Save. Otherwise, go back to the categories page. So as it says, the user may now go in and abandon changes or choose to continue and overwrite the changes with their own values. As you'd probably guess, when you're working on this type of thing, it is of paramount importance that you are constantly, testing, checking. You want to break your own code if you can. You don't want someone else to break it. All right. The site also needs to check for conflicts when a user attempts to delete a category. They may decide to delete a category being unaware that someone else has edited it. If this is the case, optimistic concurrency can be used to inform them in the same way that they used for edits. So they run through how that is done. So if you try to do that, as is shown here on page 401, all right, you get an error message when you attempt to delete a category that's been edited by another user. The category you attempted to delete has been modified by another user after you loaded it. The delete has not been performed. The current values are shown above. If you still want to delete this, click the delete button. All right. Finally, the last thing, I believe the last thing that's covered in here. Running raw SQL queries via the entity framework. Let me clear this up quickly. Oops. On occasion, you may want to run your own SQL query. To do this, you have three options depending on what will be returned from the database. All right. You can use db.set SQL query when an entity is to be returned by the query. You can use database.sql query when, and as it says, that should be used for queries that return types other than entities. And you can use database.execute SQL command for other non-query commands like updates and deletes. All right, so this is for non-select queries. Queries should be parameterized to prevent SQL injection attacks where input into web pages could be interpreted as SQL. So in other words, when they say they should be parameterized, you're going to be using the @ sign here so that you can configure at runtime exactly what it is you want to put in. So they tell you to modify the get version of delete so that it allows you to retrieve a category entry by ID. So again, as the program is running. The result of these changes, as mentioned on the top of page 402, is to run the query to return a category using the ID variable as a parameter query. All right, so you've got a little bit more latitude, for lack of better words, as you're running this. Adding custom pages to the website. On page 402, during the file upload process, we added a custom error controller. It seems to be a common question from developers about how to add custom error pages to ASP.NET MVC websites, so the author is going to go over them briefly here. Now, one thing about this is, again, as a developer, and you're constantly working with the people you're creating the application for, all right, but sometimes they don't know what they want, and this may be the time where you've got a common look and feel in a website that you decide for error pages you want it to look different. All right. The website currently uses standard error pages, 500 when an error occurs, 404 for a page not found. To change this, we're going to set up some views and change the web config file to use these custom views. So they want you to modify the web.config and add the code that's shown in here. Notice they're removing status codes 404 and 500 and replacing them with their own page not found error and their own internal server error pages. To do that, as mentioned here, add two methods to the error controller.cs for the page not found and the internal server error. It says now right-click in each method and add two empty views using a layout page. And then you come in here. So in other words, if you look, sorry, the requested page cannot be found. One thing you want to always make sure of when you're doing this is you never want to give anyone who's running your program too much information. For instance, if there was a database problem, you don't want to let them know that. All right, and I've seen that before where people actually do let people know about problems, and what ends up happening is they give them so much information, and it's information that a user doesn't need and that a hacker or a potential hacker would actually want to be able to use, and you don't want to do that. All right. Finally, and this is it, common entity framework problems and workarounds. There's about 3 of these on pages 404 and 405. When working with the entity framework, there are a few issues you may run into. So here are the causes and fixes. Number 1, cannot attach the file path / database name.mdf as database. This issue is caused by the database having previously existed and been attached to your SQL Server instance being deleted in an attempt to recreate it, where SQL Server will not allow you to attach it because it still has a reference to the, quote, old database. This can be fixed by attempting to detach and delete. So basically you detach it from SQL Server and then you reattach. Second, code first migrations become out of order or no longer run correctly. The cause, as it says here, this issue tends to be caused by something you've done unintentionally. For example, if you work with 2 database contexts and do not reset the migrations when you add the second context, everything will look like it's working okay, but when you delete the database and try to recreate it, only the migrations added during the second context will run, and you'll get a message such as unable to create table X due to a foreign key violation. Workarounds. It says in this scenario, your best option is to reset your migrations. And they go through the 5-step process and how to do that here. Finally, you want to roll back a migration. You've updated the database based on some code. You want to remove your changes from the database. You have a couple of options. Either create a new migration for the code state, or if there's a migration that you want to roll back, do this by an update minus database minus target migration and then the name of that migration. So, long chapter that covered advanced topics that may be encountered when using ASP.NET MVC with the entity framework. It's about time to jump into Chapter 11, using entity framework code first with an existing database, and that is 1, 2, 3, 4. That is a relatively short chapter, about 20 pages in length. So I hope to be able to do that today and come back and also do Chapter 12, Introduction to ASP.NET Core version 1, MVC 6 and EF7, and then put off until next week the Chapter 13 and talk a little bit about Azure. So that's it for Chapter 10.